This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey there, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 171 of the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Most discussions around social emotional learning are about helping kids stay regulated, healthy, and adjusted. But we can't forget about the adults. Being in any type of role that involves caring for others can be incredibly dysregulating, whether you're a K-12 professional or a parent. That's why in this episode, I'm highlighting past interview clips with guests that address emotional regulation and self-care in adults. In this episode, you'll hear discussions on how to teach behavioral expectations in class and why this can help maintain safety and security among staff and students, how to use co-regulation strategies to manage challenging behaviors such as eloping or property destruction, how to support bus drivers, security guards, and other non-teaching school personnel who interact with students, and the discussion on self-care in adults, especially in the leadership positions. Administrators think that self-care is important for students and teachers, but are they remembering to take care of themselves? And we wrap up by discussing self-care and how it's marketed, and how we can go beyond fluffy self-care tips like wine and bubble baths, and instead work on creating sustainable habits so that self-care can actually appeal to people in leadership positions who are drivers and don't really resonate with the way that self-care is typically marketed, and so that we don't overcomplicate it, so we actually do it. The clips that you are about to hear come from episode 152, The Cost of Caring, Compassion, Fatigue, and Education with Chrissy Mambella. She shares a great example of how she sets behavioral expectations with her students, as well as strategies for teaching kids how to be aware of when they're getting dysregulated and even start to learn about how their brains work so that they can regulate themselves, as well as learn to co-regulate others in their environment. And then we shift to a conversation with Lisa Navarra, episode 111, Supporting Self-Regulation in K-12 Kids. So the conversation with Chrissy is centered around both regulating the kids and the adults. This conversation was interesting, and I wanted to share this part of my interview with Lisa because she talked about something that I haven't heard people do very often, which is how do we support those other people who are interacting with the kids, especially in those environments that tend to be particularly noisy and really overstimulating, like the bus. And then the last interview clip that I will share is my conversation with Dr. Teresa Melito-Connors in episode 103, Self-Care Cabaret for Teachers, Therapists, and School Leaders, where Dr. MC shares her dissertation research that she did relating to self-care and how the adults leading those in education view their own self-care. And then we also talk about just the marketing behind it and why self-care isn't appealing to certain people who probably really need it. Before we get going, I wanted to remind you to check out the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. Obviously, when we're talking about behavioral expectations and regulation, this has to do with executive functioning. So some of the things that are shared in these interviews have to do with executive functioning and how we might do this at a classroom level, as well as how important it is to teach some of these strategies to other people who are working with kids. Really, if you are doing intervention, you want to be thinking about those other people that you can train. And as I said before, we can't forget those other people who are interacting with kids throughout the school day. They need those strategies as well so that kids can come to school regulated and supported. To learn more about the program, you're going to want to go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now, please enjoy this episode. We'll start off with a clip from episode 152 with Chrissy Mumbella.
This is before I even knew that Mark Brackett's work on being an emotional scientist existed. I would just tell them like, ooh, you're going to get curious, because I wanted them to be in a space of curiosity versus judging their behavior. I started to teach my students about their brain so that when they were dysregulated, I could then model for them how to regulate. And I would even show it when I was starting to get dysregulated. So for example, I had a group of 8th graders who they were not fans of doing any homework. And they were also very much fans of being incredibly disruptive in class. And so I started to, rather than my former strategy would have been to raise my voice and do all the, instead, I would start saying, you know what, I'm going to take a break. And I want you to figure out how we're going to be able to work together on this. And I would physically walk out of the room. I wouldn't leave outright. Yeah. I would walk out of the room. I'd close the door and it would be quiet. And then I'd hear a couple kids say, hey, that's not right what we did to Miss M. We got to fix this. And then they would start talking about how they could fix it. And I would listen for that. Now, I was able to do that because I spent the first 4 to 6 weeks at the start of the school year teaching expectations. So I taught when we're in silent reading, this is what silent reading looks like, but this is what silent reading doesn't look like. And we were goofy about it. We did a T-chart and we were like, this is what it is and this is what it isn't. But then we also did a T-chart on this is what the students are doing and this is what I as a teacher am doing. So they understood what it is that they were doing and what it is that I was doing, so that they knew, okay, in this time, at this space, if I'm doing silent reading, if I'm doing small group work, or if I'm doing large group work, because I was a structured teacher, but I also wanted flexibility. And what I mean by that is, and I just did this activity with a staff as an icebreaker, as a connector. I asked them conversation level, because there's a framework called CHAMPS, which is around conversation, help, activity, movement, participation, and then I always forget the S. I'm so sorry.
We'll link to it. I'm writing down all these things that you're saying so we can link in the show notes.
So the conversation level, I want to highlight because that is from our own personal lived experiences and our cultural background. And I don't mean just cultural, in terms of ethnicity. I mean your family dynamic and so forth. So the connecting question was, when you were growing up, what was the average conversation level in your household? And how is that similar or different than the expectation in your classroom today? And they just would go and meet and talk to people. And I had a little chart, 0 being completely silent, 5 being you're outdoors, you're probably shouting across the the yard in some way, so it's a louder voice. And we did that, and I modeled it with my colleague and I, because we were both co-presenting. She said, oh, well, in my household, it was smaller. There were only 4 of us. And we were probably at what we would consider an average, a level 3. And I said, what would happen if somebody was in trouble? She's like, oh, it would be a level 5. You'd hear yelling and shouting and so forth. I said, okay, in my household, the average was a level 5. There were 5 kids, 2 adults. So there's 7 of us in a household. And we were just loud, boisterous family. So blah, 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 blah. We would talk over each other, all kinds of stuff. So the average was a 5. The opposite, when people were upset, it was down to like a 2, like, ooh, you'd walk in and it'd be quiet. You're like, ooh, someone's in trouble. So how did that show up in my classroom? In her classroom, she wanted a level 3. That's what she was known. That's what she knew. That's what she was familiar with. In my classroom, I was fine with a level 5.
Mm-hmm.
I knew it. I was familiar with it. And the reason I bring that up is because when we think about discipline, if I as a teacher want a certain expectation to be done, then it's important to teach it versus assume it, even down to the way we communicate. Because if a student's coming in and they're super loud and that's not your comfort level, then it's important to teach that expectation. Otherwise, they're going to come in super loud. You're going to ask them to be quiet. They may not know how to be their voice to be lowered or know really well how to do it. They're then getting in trouble. Then it escalates. And so then you go from a child who was probably regulated to potentially being dysregulated because they don't understand why they're in trouble now because they're just talking, right? I'm just talking. What's the problem? I'm just talking.
Right.
And then it becomes this larger thing. The other pieces that I get curious about is that when I ask people how they define discipline, and I just say, use a couple words, like in potentially creating like a word cloud or something along those lines, people think of discipline as punitive and think of discipline as a compliance indicator. So it's almost like spare the rod, spoil the child. You must be punitive. They must get punished if they don't do something.
Right.
But yet, when we pivot to adulthood and we talk about discipline becomes about
That's
like
interesting.
Our focus, our inner discipline, our consistency. So we pivot the meaning. So I'm curious as to why we have it in the zero tolerance, punishment, compliance based mindset for children, but for adults, we expect something different. And
that is really interesting.
And that I am curious about, because it's like, well, when I look at the actual meaning of the word, like if you look at and you break down the word discipline and you look at it from its Latin root, it's around in students and instruction. So if its meaning is to instruct, to teach, to be a student who's taking in, why then at a child level are we taking it as you're going to be compliant, you're going to do as I say, not as I do, and you're going to do X, Y, and Z. But it doesn't work because it doesn't help. It doesn't teach co-regulation. It doesn't teach how to be able to be in my body when I'm upset, because the reality is we all have emotions. So I find it really curious that we pivot in that way, because if a child, and especially like I think about it after the pandemic, everyone, you started to hear about staff self-care, take care of yourself. And people started to become angry about saying like, take care of myself. Like nobody's taking care of me. Like, what are you talking about? And because really there is a huge difference between individual self-care and organizational care. And in social emotional learning, if we look at this, in order for it to be effective, it really needs to start with adults, because our adults, like looking at the competencies, and I'm in a community of practice now that I'm co-facilitating with another colleague around adult SEL. No one actually taught us, like what those competencies are from a generational standpoint. Younger generations may have experienced it, but most older generations didn't have an experience of learning about, self-awareness and self-management and decision-making. That wasn't a part of the conversation. So if it's not a part of the conversation, and now it is, how do we check in with understanding it ourselves so that we don't see it as some gimmicky thing we have to do with kids?
Yeah.
And instead check in with how we feel about these things, how we see these things. Because I think one of the things that happens is our language is important. So like if we are saying, I am feeling, or I am thinking, just means something that's happening in a certain space of time. If I say I am this, then it's really a state of being.
Right.
And that is a different way of framing something. So if I'm
Mhm.
feeling anxious right
Absolutely.
now, like if I'm feeling anxious in my body right now, or I'm feeling X, Y, and Z in my body right now, that just means that it's temporary, and I can work with you on that, or somebody can work with me on that. Maybe there's
Hmm.
breathing strategies I could be doing. Maybe there's some journaling I can be doing. But if I walk around continually saying I am anxious, then I'm walking around in a heightened, that I'm basically saying I'm walking around in a heightened state.
Like it's
And
part of me permanently, like a permanent trait versus a temporary experience.
right. And so by doing that, we also have to be careful about what we say with kids as well, and how
Hmm.
we teach kids about that. Because, for example, social emotional learning, if you're teaching a lesson at the beginning of the day, that's great. But what's really powerful is if you embed it and infuse it throughout your day. So if, for
Mm-hmm.
example,
Yeah.
sticking with this example of anxiety, what if we talked about when are those times where you do feel anxious? When I pause and I think about it, and I can model that, right? Like I can model talking about it, going, I feel anxious when I'm about to take a test. I feel anxious when I'm going to do something new that I'm not sure what the outcome will be. Um, I feel anxious when, and you start to talk about those things and model it for kids, then all of a sudden they start to think about, oh, I feel anxious with this. And they start to add in. And I remember one of my colleagues and I, when we were teaching, and it was around the time of test taking, we would stop on Fridays and talk about test taking strategies. We talk about our own experiences with test taking, and then we'd ask them what their experiences were like. So that by the time the test came, right before the test, we would say, okay, let's take some deep breaths. What are some things we can say to ourselves right now to prepare for this? Knowing that all of you have shared in some way that you feel anxious or stressed when you're about to do that. So you've now taught it, and now
Hmm.
you're putting it in context, and you're
Hmm.
modeling it again. So you're repeating it. And these are not things that are taking hours upon end. Like you teach it for 30 minutes and then you infuse it. You're looking at 1 or 2 minutes during the times that you're doing it. And that's a great way to infuse teaching. How do I regulate? How do I get in a space that I can access my learning? Because when you think about that punitive piece of discipline, if we go back to that, if you have a child who's anxious and they're in a fight or flight response, and they either are going to leave your classroom or leave the space they're in, they're not supposed to, so they're a runner, well, then the adults are going to try to run after them to find out where they're at and make sure they're safe. And yet, or if they're in the classroom and they're destroying the classroom, then the teacher is probably going to try to take her class, the rest of the class, and have them leave so that they could be safe.
Hmm.
But this might be where it gets a little tricky.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Cause like all the stuff that you've said are like so many great proactive things, but
mhm,
proactive can definitely prevent a lot of things from escalating to this point, but they don't always. So
right. So
yeah.
now you're in
So
a
what do we
space of
do?
like kid is running, you have a group of kids that you're supposed to take care of, like, or the kid is destroying the classroom space, which that does happen, and you
Yeah.
have kids. So now you're in a space of like, well, I have to protect the other children. I have to protect myself. Like
Right.
you go into this protection mode. And when we go into that protection mode, what do we typically do? We also, unless we're aware, go into fight or flight.
Hmm. Yeah. So hard
So,
to get
right,
back into the
right.
calm space.
And so, like a strategy, which some people may think, oh, this is ridiculous. Why would you do that? But if we're looking at it from a space of inclusion, and we're looking at it from a space of this is a learning opportunity, because all of what we deal with in schools is truly a learning opportunity for anyone involved, even though it might be hard to see it that way. If I have a child who is destroying the classroom, if I've taken the time to teach the entire class about how to be aware in my body, how to be present in my space, I've learned some deep breaths. I've learned about maybe saying some things about I am safe, I'm okay, I will be okay, I'm
Hmm.
having a hard time right now, or even expressing like if I am struggling in that moment, And I know that if I can get to just enough of that frontal lobe to assess the situation, to know that I'm not being harmed, you could leave your classroom. You can leave your students in the classroom space with you, pull them back, and have them thinking about how they're regulating themselves in this moment, how you're regulating yourself in that moment, and how you can send positive thoughts to the child who's being disruptive. Like it's going to be okay. It's hard right now, but we're all in this together. And the reason that's important is because you are now in that moment. I'm not saying this is easy. None of this is easy.
Yeah.
But in that moment, you are sending that message to that child that they are not being abandoned. They are not leaving. You are modeling for other children. They are not being abandoned. They are not being left. And we are not rejecting the child who's struggling. So there's not that rejection. There's not that fear. We are using it as a teaching opportunity. Now, it doesn't mean you're not asking other people to come in for assistance. It doesn't mean that at some point you may not leave. It just means that at the starting point, everybody is there and recognizing that we have a shared humanity. There's shared humanity. I see you, you see me, and you're having a hard time right now. And I'm going to model for you how to not have a hard time while you're having that hard time, because that's the part is where it's different. So remember when I was talking about like my son, and I know all the strategies, but I'm getting dysregulated watching him not do anything. And I'm tired and I'm not at my best. And so I had to get to the point of like my amygdala, that part of my brain that has no language, got hijacked. How do I get myself in a space where I have the language and I can then say what needs to be said to help my body calm down?
Now we'll move to episode 111 with Lisa Navarra.
A lot of times I think that when people criticize just the idea of a behavior plan, one of the main criticisms I've heard is, well, you're just focusing on what's going on externally. You're not really focusing on the skills that are behind whatever it is that you're seeing, the quote, behaviors. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's a certain mentality. So there's a couple of things there. So when it comes to a behavior plan, it really is oftentimes I found that teachers look at it as, I just need to keep data so that way that child can finally get the services which I can't provide within this setting. Instead of seeing it as, I'm trained, I have the information and the skill set to be able to implement it with the understanding of it's not so much being able to perform a task, but really being able to set up the groundwork and the environment for that particular student to learn specific skills to be able to perform that overall task. So let me give you a little example.
Okay.
So, for instance, I am consulting currently in a preschool, and the teacher said to me, okay, how do I get this child to wash his hands calmly, not make a mess, and then run away from the sink? And the same thing she asked me, he talks so loud. Is there any way we can get him to like tone it down a little bit? And I tried to explain to her, she was very receptive. And I said to her, it's not so much about the task of washing hands. It's slowing him down and raising his self-awareness, which is really building his ability to self-regulate. And I had to explain that because it's a different way of viewing our role as an educator. And when I say educator, Karen, I mean anybody really who's working with children, because we're teaching and we're modeling always. So with that, we can see, okay, I need to get this done. So this is what they need to do to reach that objective or that goal. But if we can also integrate and infuse a line of thinking, I need to support and promote the child to be able to control or manage his or her thoughts, feelings, and actions. Now I'll be able to reach those objectives and goals. So I said to her, all right, well, we need to slow him down. And explaining to him is just simply not enough. Modeling to him is good, but it doesn't give him the strategies of being able to slow down himself.
Mm-hmm.
So when I introduced it to him, we said, all right, we're going to count. We'll count to 10. And listen, something like that, you might have to adjust it. If 10's too long, maybe 5. If he doesn't know how to count to 10, because this is a preschool example, we make it lower. We do the ABCs, whatever it is. 10 did work, but counting was set the structure, but breathing at the same time was helping him to be able to see and know how to slow down real time. So what I had taught him prior in the class as well is to breathe with smelling the flowers. Well, he likes butterflies. So now we use butterflies. So he smells the butterflies and blows out the candles. And if your listeners can't see us right now, I have a breathing ball that's really easy to get, and the kids absolutely love it. And we open it on the inhale and we close it on the exhale. And by combining the ability to see visually how to breathe along with staying structured and counting, it really slowed him down to the point where the teacher was able to do it for the rest of the week, even like without me going, because I just go, that's just part of what I do. So without me going to reinforce it. So it's, you see, it's the ability to understand we need to teach self-regulation strategies and self-awareness to be able to reach those goals or those even objectives within those behavior plans as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously we're talking a lot about executive functioning here and the self-regulation piece, but really just teaching students to pause, reset, check in with themselves, look around the room, read the situation, and also just feel what's going on in their bodies or whatever's going on in those situations, to just get themselves to think about, what's going on. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Exactly. Yes, because I don't think they can be one without the other. And I think with education now, we need to have that paradigm shift in being able to see things differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that's just what people don't realize is that obviously all these skills, like there are steps to washing your hands. You need to teach them the steps, but you're not going to pay attention to the steps if you don't remember to just kind of pause, reset, and check in with yourself at various times. When you're working with, let's see, so you said security guards, bus drivers. I remember when I was in the schools that there were certain students that we'd always hear like, oh, this happened on the bus, and whatever the situation was, and the bus drivers just not really knowing how to set things up or just really how to deal with those situations. So what do you do, like if you're working with bus drivers who have students who, let's say that they had students who were in your class that needed certain supports in place, how do you teach them to provide that support on the bus, especially considering how overstimulating a school bus can be?
Well, one of my goals is to help bridge the gap of communication between the bus drivers and schools, because I know, and especially the minibuses, for the riders with special needs, they want to know, they want to help these students, but they just don't know a lot of times. So what I used to do, I mean, I don't do this anymore. That's kind of out of my immediate scope where I'm more training now, but I used to work with the student and set them up for success on the bus. So, I really was mindful in what are the factors on the bus to make sure that it's just providing a little bit of structure. So that way it's a constant reminder of, I can do this. I've got this. I've got the strategies to be able to just have a happy, safe bus ride. And also it's teaching. I used to go onto the bus and I used to say to the driver assistants, and I would say, okay, when, Susie gets up out of her seat, takes her seatbelt on, I need you to do me a favor so that way she can focus. Take your own breath, remind her to take a breath, ask her to focus, and then to please sit. Say it firm, but say it in a neutral tone of voice. And then I would also tell Susie, okay, this is how Jessica's going to help you to remember to sit down. So now everybody is on the same page of communication. There's a couple strategies there that are being reinforced in the classroom, but now extended onto the bus.
Yeah. So it's a combination of front loading and teaching strategies and then giving the people that are there, the adults, the information.
Yeah, it's important.
This last clip is from episode 103 with Dr. Teresa Melito-Connors.
So what did you actually study in your dissertation research? Like what was the study about?
Yeah. So the degree is actually a PhD in educational leadership, but my main area of scholarship was self-care and renewal. So the dissertation title has like one of those like super long, very academic titles. Yeah. I'll tell you what it is, but it's the perceptions of private special education school leaders regarding their role in promoting self-care and renewal practices for themselves and their teachers. So at the time when I was doing the study, I was actually working for a trade association here in Massachusetts that supports all the private special education schools. And so that was those were going to be my study participants, and they were willing and eager to be a part of it and share their information. So I surveyed them, I interviewed several of them to kind of come up with the data for the dissertation study.
Yeah. So, I mean, what did you find throughout that process that surprised you?
Yeah.
Other than the fact that you're not the only person struggling with this.
I knew that before, but yeah, for sure. The findings were really interesting. I think a couple that stood out to me, I think there were three that really stand out to me the most. The first was that school leaders felt that self-care and renewal practices were more important for their teachers than for themselves. Like on the responses, it was all like about, yeah, this is super important. Yep. They're very important. High, but 5s or whatever. And then it was like, oh yeah, but no, not for me. Less important for me. So that was interesting to me. I don't know if, and that's certainly not the message that I like to give to people. Like, you have to take care of yourself as a leader, and you also promote it for others. It's not something other people need and you don't. That's not it. So I thought that was interesting. Another one was that people really don't tend to start paying attention to their self-care until later in life, when either they just start feeling the impacts of aging, or they're faced with a health consequence or a health scare of some sort. Yeah. And then all of a sudden the light bulb goes off and they're like, uh-oh, I better start taking care of myself. So part of my work, I like to get younger generations to really pay attention to this stuff, because it's not something that should wait until you're in a crisis situation to start paying attention to.
Yeah. It's, I mean, just from a motivation standpoint, it's easy to just put it off when you're young and you can just power through. And I mean, there's so many different examples of that. That's really interesting that the administrators thought it was important for the teachers and not, or the staff and not them. I wonder if that is common in other situations where there's a person who is responsible for the care of others. So for example, again, the leadership thinks that it's important for their staff, but not for them. Mm-hmm. The staff think it's important for their students, but not for them.
Absolutely.
They think it's important for their kids, but not for them. Like, and all of these other things, you always think about the person you're taking care of and not thinking about, what about me? How am I supposed to take care of somebody else if I'm not in a good place?
Right, because self-care, society makes us feel that it's selfish. That's the messaging, that you can't, it's selfish to take your paid time off. It's selfish to put your needs first. Who does that? But it's a really twisted view of what it is. And people don't understand that self-care is other care. It allows you to be able to show up better for your students, for your staff, for your children, for everyone.
Yeah. I wonder if it's just, do you think it's just that people don't understand what it actually is? Like, it's being presented in a way like you're overindulging, you're drinking all this wine and taking a bubble bath and all this stuff. And like it's like people are kind of overdoing it and making it seem like it's something that it's not. Do you think that that happens?
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what is self-care. And there's a lot of marketing around self-care. It's big business now. There's corporations and, you know, all kinds of things preying on your vulnerability to try and sell you things and make like, but that's not it. And then you have those, you know, kind of stereotypical depictions of self-care that it's really expensive and luxurious and it has to be these all-day spa events or mani-pedis and like that's not really what we're talking about when we get to the true meaning of self-care.
It's interesting that so those examples, and I mean, obviously anybody can do whatever they want. And so I don't want to gender stereotype here, but a lot of those things traditionally have been thought of more as female things, you know, to put in air quotes. And I just wonder if that actually, again, like makes it less acceptable to, if you are more masculine to, you know, like if it's like, oh, it's okay for these people, but not these people over here. And people in leadership positions tend to be the more, you know, ambitious driver, where it's almost like not congruent with the qualities that you think you're supposed to have, you know?
Yeah, I think that definitely plays a factor. And even now, like if I look at, you know, the demographics of those that follow me or book me for presentations, like it's predominantly women.
Yeah.
You know, there are definitely, I definitely have male followers. I definitely think self-care is important for males. Also, it's important for everyone, but it does tend to be a more woman heavy, you know, thing that's more appealing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that sometimes when you define what it is, that maybe it makes it more, I don't want to say appealing, but yeah, maybe appealing. So, I mean, how would you actually define self-care? How should it look day to day?
So I think it's those stereotypical things that appear to be more feminine, maybe.
Right.
Whereas when we get, so the real definition, in my opinion, you know, is not mani-pedis and bubble baths. It's really foundational practices that you do every day so you show up as the best you possible. They don't have to be expensive. They don't have to be time consuming. As a matter of fact, they can be quick and free, which, I mean, doesn't get better than that. But it's proactive. Like you want to be doing it in a way where you're not in crisis mode and then you're like, oh my gosh, now I got to take a yoga class. Like that's not it. You don't want to get to that point. The hope is that you engage in these practices, you build up your resilience, you manage your stress in healthy, productive ways so that when those situations arise, you're able to better react to them. Because like stress isn't going to go away. We're still going to still going to have stress. But the way you react can really change by how you're taking care of yourself.
Yeah. I think that sometimes those stereotypical things can almost be counterproductive. Again, going back to the wine thing, that seems to be a trendy thing that's promoted in self-care where it's actually, I mean, alcohol is literally poison, you know, it's the opposite of self-care. Not that I'm, you know, shaming people for drinking wine. Sometimes I like to drink wine, but if you really think about it, it's more about being proactive and thinking about what your future self wants, not what your, you know, what you want in the moment. And so I think that some of those things are the opposite.
Yeah, no, that's definitely an unhealthy, soothing strategy.
Yes. Yeah.
For sure.
So what is the process? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I think I was going to start to jump into what you're going to ask.
Yeah. So what's the framework that you use for helping people or that you present to people when you're, you know, coaching or presenting people?
Yeah, so I like to look at things from the 10 domains of self-care, which actually comes from Dr. Catherine Cook Cotton's research. And the 10 domains of self-care is really, I think, a pretty comprehensive framework. And I can tell you what the domains are, but it helps people kind of conceptualize that, yeah, we're not talking about mani-pedis here. And so when we look at the 10 domains, we look at nutrition and hydration. So how you feed your body, how you hydrate, and ways to do that and honor your hunger and your fullness. Then we look at exercise. So you have to move your body. And what does that look like? And promoting, though, that it can and should be joyful. Movement should be joyful. It shouldn't be punishment or extreme. I also, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm in recovery for disordered eating and exercise bulimia. So when I get into the nutrition, hydration, and exercise domains, I really lean heavily on a health at every size perspective and the research on intuitive eating.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of plays into those as well. Then we get into looking at soothing strategies. How do you soothe yourself? Is it wine, or do you have maybe some deep breathing practices you engage in?
Mm-hmm.
Then we look at mindfulness and self-awareness. Then we look at rest and relationships, the physical medical domain, the environmental domain, self-compassion, and the last one is spiritual. And the spiritual domain is really, teachers do great in that domain because we see how important the work is that we do. And we know why we show up every day for our students. So that domain tends to be really strong among educators and folks working with kids.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I like how it's kind of laid out into specific areas. I think that having that framework can be really helpful in figuring out what to actually do. So it's not just this generic thing and you're just randomly throwing things out there. It's, okay, how are we going to think about all areas comprehensively?
Right. And the thing is too, and I always say this in my workshops, I do not try to do all 10 domains tomorrow. You can't go from 0 to 60. But and this is a piece too that I think sometimes people don't understand. Even if you just take one domain or even just one new coping mechanism, maybe it's deep breathing, or you work on your sleep, or you work on your hydration, any little bit that you do will have a really big impact. So it doesn't have to be time consuming. It can be free. And most of this is, deep breathing is one of the most wildly underutilized coping mechanisms, and it's free and you can do it literally anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. When you start with one thing, sometimes it can lead to another thing. And there's kind of this snowball and vice versa. Whereas it's okay, you can go. I was listening to this podcast and this guy was talking about how when he goes to conferences, some people are like, let's go to happy hour. And he's like, I don't go because I know that I'm going to go there and I'm going to have a drink. And then I'm going to want another drink. And then I'm going to, drink too much and stay up too late. And then I'm not going to sleep. And then I'm going to sleep in the next day. And then I'm going to be behind on my work and it's going to be 3:00 and I haven't started on anything. And I'm going to think, why do I even get started on my work? Because it's already 3:00 and then my whole weekend is derailed because of having one drink. And just knowing that it's okay, if I am going to pay attention to my nutrition and hydration domain and say, I'm not going to have a drink, or I'm going to go to my room early and get in bed early, it just impacts your whole day and vice versa. If you're going to say something like, I'm going to get in bed by 9:00 tonight, and then you get up early and then you have all this stuff done. It's the one decision that leads to the other decisions, but you're only really committing to the one thing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, but it's really, and it's powerful stuff. And I think too, once people start to feel a little bit better and feel a little success in one domain, then it's yeah, all right. What would happen if I went to bed at 8:30? Or what if we really push the envelope and really work on the sleep? I find that people, when I give, there's assessments that we do sometimes in the workshops and whatnot, and sometimes folks are just really hard on themselves because they're horrified that they score low across the board.
Yeah.
It's that's okay. That's just showing you that you have room to grow. And it's not to make anybody feel bad, but to remember that, one new habit, start small, wherever it at. Maybe you're going to walk for 5 minutes a day, or get outside for 5 minutes, or have a 5-minute dance party, get some joyful movement in, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be this epic thing, but you'll feel better pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links to the full interviews that I featured in this episode. That's episode 152, The Cost of Caring, Compassion, Fatigue, and Education in Healthcare with Chrissy Mombella, episode 111, Supporting Self-Regulation in K-12 Kids with Lisa Navarra, and episode 103, Self-Care Cabaret for Teachers, Therapists, and School Leaders with Dr. Teresa Melito-Connors. Also, don't forget to check out the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. To learn more, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. If you found this episode useful, please share it with your colleagues, and it always helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you're interested in being a guest on De Facto Leaders, please email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. You can also email me if you have a suggestion for a guest or a topic. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you next time.